It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we don't have a guest, as it is a hand that I played on my way to a 4th place finish in the Unibet Open Online in December 2020. We will, however, have many voices in the room, as I ran this hand past no fewer than 9 or 10 fellow pros, including Daniel Devoris, Dan Wilson, Dara and David, Jamie Kerstetter, Henry Kilban, Jen Shahade, and the eventual winner, Porrick O'Neill. Dara O'Kearney, as usual, is here in the flesh, and we will also be looking at what the solver recommends, given there is a lot of ICM in this one and a particularly wicked run out. Dara, thank you for putting this one under your microscope.
You're welcome, David. Yeah, it was a very interesting hand. I think you got different opinions from different people. I'm not surprised because so many of the decisions are very close and a lot depends on your understanding of ICM. When you ran this hand by me, I wasn't immediately clear what I thought the best line was on flop and river. So it's definitely an interesting hand.
Well, you're being very modest, but I know this one haunted me for days after. We'll get stuck in. So as I said, it was the Unibet Open Online. That's a €10.50 plus €50 buy-in, but it is fair to say that with lots of satellite qualifiers, it's as soft a 1k as there is out there on the interwebs. We are in the money, and I am sitting 6 of 15 with about 40 big blinds. That's pretty much average stack. Our table is 7 ways. Under the gun, 1 playing 38 big blinds, min opens, and it folds around to me on the button. I have pocket sixes. The small blind has 30 big blinds. Big blind has 55 big blinds. I elect to flat. Both blinds actually fold. The flop comes King 8-6, all clubs. He checks, and with bottom set, I bet 33%. The villain calls. Dara, without going into sizings just yet, what do you think of my decision to flat pre and my decision to bet flop?
Yeah, I think the flat pre is maybe just a little bit too loose. I think maybe the line is around 7s. One of the things when ICM becomes a factor is that the smaller pairs kind of lose a lot of their value. You kind of want hands that can make the nuts so that you have enough hands in your range that can face a lot of pressure. And you don't want so many hands that are either a weakish pair or, in the case of sets, might get set oversetted, which is obviously a disaster as well. So the small pairs tend to drop out of the range. And I think in this spot, having looked at it in Monker, I think 7s is actually supposed to be the bottom of your flatting range. But obviously 6s is just below that, so it's not a big deal. The flop is a really tricky spot because I know from running a lot of ICM sims that 2 things happen when ICM is a big factor. First of all, the betting frequency tends to go down, and we also are incentivized to use smaller sizings. So when you sent this hand to me originally, my gut instinct was we should either check the flop here or bet really small sizing, probably just the minimum, bet 1 big blind. Having put it to the solver bears that out. The solver actually splits between checking and betting 1 big blind roughly half the time. And it does that with its entire range. We have some really strong hands on this board. We have a lot of flushes because we'll be calling stuff like suited aces pre-flop. So we can have the nut flush here. We also have probably all the sets except kings. But again, that comes back to one problem we have in the hand, in that our sets are not nutted here. Apart from the fact that they can run into flushes, they can also get set oversetted. So we don't have a massive range advantage here. We have something of a range advantage because we have a higher percentage of flushes in our range and we have more of the sets probably, but we have to proceed with caution basically. And the way the solver splits its range here is it takes all of its stronger hands and it sometimes checks them, sometimes bets them, and then it takes the weakest hands in its range, ace highs for example, with no club, so no prospect of making the nut flush, and it also bets those at some frequency, not all that often, but sometimes to balance out the stronger hands, but mostly it checks behind.
For what it's worth, every single one of the players mentioned above said they would bet between 25 and 40%. Daniel Devoris guessed it might be a mix, but leaned towards betting 30% more often in practice. Henry checked, and Dara, as you mentioned there, when faced with me sort of putting you on the spot in real time, I didn't really want players to be able to have the luxury of having a long think about it, because I obviously didn't have that luxury, and I was keen to get people's sort of immediate gut reaction. I remember you saying probably somewhere between 15 and 20%, and of course about 15% is the min bet, so quite right there. It turns out you were spot on. To the turn, it comes an offsuit ace. Villain checks, and this time I bet 62%. Again, villain calls. I feel like there's a big switch in range advantage with this card, but I do have a set, and there's a very good chance that my opponent has a decent number of inferior hands that he can call with. Everybody polled, including yourself, Dara, bet between 50 and 75% on this street. So my bet is bang in the middle of those. Again, you advocated the smallest sizing, bang on 50%, as did Dan Wilson. It's fair to say that there are some interesting solver findings on this street, and perhaps we're even meant to go smaller again.
Yeah, I gave the solver a couple of different sizings here. The one you used, an overbet sizing as well of over pot and also 1/3 pot. And with pretty much all the hands that it wants to bet, it just wants to use a smaller sizing, 1/3 pot. With sixes specifically, it actually mixes in quite a few checks as well. It bets just over half the time, but it checks behind half the time as well. And that's kind of a recognition of just how extreme the ICM pressure is on us. Now, we cover our opponent, so the pressure is also on him, but he's so close to us that we really don't want to get all in a situation where we don't have the nuts. So that's kind of driving our strategy here. We're incentivized to deny equity to a lot of his hands that have continued and to get value from weaker hands, as you said. But we don't really want to get all the chips in here. So the solver ends up advocating a small sizing.
And is there anything exploitative that could give more credence to going a sort of a 50% sizing, as is sort of the lower band of what this collection of pros opted for?
When we use the smaller sizing here, the villain is supposed to always continue with all of his ace X, but start giving up with some of his king X, which was top pair but hasn't improved. Now, if we use the smaller sizing, he's actually supposed to start folding some of his weaker ace X as well. But if we're up against somebody who's a bit stationary and we think that they're going to continue with all of their ace X, irrespective of what sizing we use, then I guess you could make a case for using the larger sizing and let them make the mistake of continuing with some weaker ace X that they shouldn't continue with.
That's a great answer. Well, to the river, the SPR is 1.15 to 1. It comes another offsuit ace. I bet the more learned people out there could almost have predicted this one. He checks. I took my time on this. I actually considered checking back. The villain obviously has a huge range and nut advantage now, but I still felt as though there were must-call hands, trip aces, flushes, maybe even king-queen with the queen of clubs might flick in a cry call. So I felt like it would be a sin to lose value to those hands. In the end, I decided to bet 30%, targeting exactly that type of hand. Put in the same spot, Jamie Kerstetter, Dara Davy, Smidge and Jen Shahade bet almost exactly the same amount. Dan Wilson bet 50%. Daniel Devoris mixed between 60% of the time going a 60% sizing and 40% of the time checking. Henry Kilban stuck it all in. Dara, you were the only one who said pure check in real time. And spoiler alert, that's pretty much what the solver does. As I recall from our post game, you said it would be 90% of the time the solver would go with the check line. Why are all these top pros and me so wrong? Or is it actually a reasonable exploit?
I mean, again, it can be a reasonable exploit against the field. It always depends on the players you're playing against. You're not playing against a solver. A solver can exploit you by checking all of its really strong hands here that beat pocket sixes and check raising. And then if you're always calling, you're in a pretty horrible spot. But a real life opponent may not do that. The other thing is the solver will exploit you by picking some bluffs as well to balance the value that it has in this spot. And again, a lot of people, they might check all their strong hands to you going for the check raise, but they may not have enough bluffs. So you can exploitatively bet fold to the check raise. So it always really depends on the assumptions you can make. But the only thing we can say is that from the solver at equilibrium does just want to check behind here because it doesn't want to open up the door to the check raise.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will say in real time, that was my consideration. I did think to myself, well, Unibet doesn't allow HUDs. It's a pretty much anonymous site. Obviously I've seen the guy play for that tournament, but they can change their avatars and their aliases at will in between tournaments. So this is pretty much the one and only time I'm facing this villain. So I have to kind of treat it as a spot as such, or maybe lean into population tendencies. What I felt like the population tendency would be if I laid such an appealing price to call with, say, a flush or trips. That's what I would face. And I figured that my opponent would rarely, if ever, go for a bluff line here, because it has to pretty much turn a value hand into a bluff, because it doesn't really get to the river with any pure bluffs.
Yeah, this is a spot where it is hard to find bluffs, and that's something humans always struggle with. Solvers will just pick the appropriate number of hands. It works out how much value it has and how many bluffs it needs, and then it just picks the best candidates it has. And it doesn't tend to favor just one hand in particular. It just uses low frequency bluffs with enough hands to get to the right overall number. Now, most humans are nowhere near as balanced, and in really tricky spots like this, they tend to either over bluff or under bluff, and that should be a much bigger consideration for us in game. Do we think it's likely that the opponent is over bluffing or under bluffing rather than, well, what's the equilibrium response?
Fair enough. Well, in response to my 30% bet, the villain shoved, and after some crying behind my keyboard, I found the fold. I must say that the crying wasn't a cry fold. I had made myself a promise that I would bet fold. There would be no heroics this time. I was crying because I almost checked and wondered if I had just, bit like what you said there a moment ago, Dara, opened the door to a thinking player who could represent all the super strong hands when I just couldn't. Dara, how bad would the call have been had I been so foolish to make it?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked already about flop and turn, and both of your decisions were slightly suboptimal. You used a larger sizing than you should have on the flop. But at this point in the tournament, you have roughly 12,000 in equity. The decision to use a smaller sizing would only gain you an extra €10 in equity. So it's a very minor point. Similarly, on the turn, the sizing that you used, again, suboptimal. You should have used a smaller sizing, but you only lose about a tenner by virtue of using that sizing. The river, however, is the point where a lot of equity is at stake, and this is fairly typical in ICM extreme situations. Obviously, the pot is bigger, but also the potential to make a mistake is much larger. Your decision to bet rather than check at equilibrium, that loses you just over €100. But as we said, as an exploit, it might work if the guy is under bluffing. If you do call it off, though, that's a huge error. That's an error of over €1,300. So that's the point at which you could really go badly wrong and torch a lot of equity. Again, we always have to ask who we're up against, but given that we kind of feel it's more likely that the opponent is under bluffing rather than over bluffing here, that would actually make the error even bigger because it's less likely that he has the right number of bluffs. So the actual error could be in excess of €2,000.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I didn't make that one. It was an interesting spot overall. I'm pretty happy with how I played it, I guess. As you said, small amounts of equity, which maybe could be justifiable as small exploits. Fortunately, I was able to spin up my short stack and make a bit of a run on the final table. Obviously, I was playing for second because it was written in the stars that Pádraig O'Neill was going to go back-to-back that time, and delighted we were to see that happen. I guess the lesson in this one is both an ICM one and one about how to play across a board where the range advantage reverses dramatically. Dara, can you sum up for us?
Yeah, as I said when we were discussing the flop, when ICM is extreme, and it's very extreme in this case because you guys are both middling stacks and you have roughly the same amount of chips. So you're both heavily incentivized not to bust right now. So that leads to a kind of a tippy-tappy approach where you play much more passively than normal. You do a lot more checking. I think people would be surprised to see the amount of checking the solver does on every street here. Quite a lot of checking behind on the flop with a set, checking almost half the time on the turn still with a set, and then checking behind on the river with a boat, which again is not something we would ever do if ICM wasn't a factor. Point number 2 is that the sizings just go down. We use small sizings on every street. The solver only wants to use the min bet sizing on the flop. It only wants to use third pot on the turn. But by the time we get to the river, given that it's checking behind a lot and it's not going to be betting too much, it does actually start to use a bigger sizing then. So that's the street we see the 2/3 size on. But as a general rule, particularly on the early streets, the sizings go down because of the ICM pressure on both players.
Yeah, and that makes an awful lot of sense because had I played it like the solver, there would be so much less in that pot that really I wasn't putting stacks at risk to the same degree by putting in a slightly larger river bet.
Yeah, ICM becomes a huge factor when the stack to pot ratio is such that you could conceivably get all in by the river, and that affects every part of your strategy. Going back even to pre-flop, your opponent's opening range should be a lot more weighted towards suited hands, particularly suited aces that can flop the nuts, and a lot of small pairs and trouble hands like king, jack, king 10. He shouldn't be opening anymore. The offsuit varieties. Even stuff like ace 10, ace jack doesn't really get opened anymore, and the smaller pairs all disappear. Similarly, in your range, you can't just flat lots of stuff like king jack anymore because of ICM. You have a fairly narrow flatting range, probably the pairs between queens and sevens or sixes, depending on where you want to draw the line. Some of the suited aces that need to be reasonably strong, and you really can't be calling too much offsuit stuff like king queen off can't be called all the time here. Ace jack off can't be called all the time.
That's really good advice. Well, just to sum up in another way, Daniel DeVoris had a great line for me, which I'm going to quote from. He said, yeah, generally under this much ICM pressure, it's great to just keep flinging in small bets, which I guess is the essence of this one and the lesson we have learned. Dara O'Kearney, thank you so much for giving extra scrutiny to this. And as I said, it did haunt me a wee bit in the days after. And it was great to find out that I certainly hadn't butchered it. There were better ways to play it. But more importantly, there were lessons to be learned of how to maybe approach similar spots in the future, which is hopefully not just going to help me, but maybe help our listeners too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to fold a boat. One of the things Andrew Brockus always says is it's very hard to change your mind in game on the strength of your hand. You go from thinking, oh, wow, I have a boat that's a really strong hand, I should bet that, to having to think, oh, now I have to fold it because of the actions that my opponent has taken. So well done in finding the fold. I think a lot of people here wouldn't have been able to find it. Even if they kind of knew deep down, psychologically, it's pretty tough.
It sure was. Dara O'Kearney, thank you so much.
Thanks, David.